This is the third part of Unit 2, Prominence in the Utterance. Let's review some of the topics that we have seen in Unit 2 so far. Well, we have started with the concept of meaning in prominence, and especially the notion of pragmatic meaning. Then we have started with the specific selection of prominence from the viewpoint of semantics, only at the word level. And we also have seen how this semantic sense selection affected, the choice of prominence both in paradigmatic and syntagmatic relationships. Well, in this dimension, we're going to find a very specific group of words then that uh, are related to the previous domain of sense selection of prominence, the semantic sense selection of prominence, because they have some very fixed rules regarding prominence. Well, we're talking about these special formulaic expressions that are called conversational routines, if they appear in a conversation, idiomatic expressions, multi-word units, and some discourse markers. Well, these conversation routines, we know that they are used, they have an everyday use, and they are actually utilized by many speakers to perform specific speech acts. That is, they have an elocution force. But what is interesting about them is that they actually have a very fixed wording and usually very fixed prominence, and a certain degree of idiomaticity, that is, of metaphorical meaning, that is associated with them. So some of these conversational routines cannot be seen at one extreme, but they are rather a continuum in terms of the idiomaticity. So some of these conversational routines are more idiomatic in the sense that they have a very fixed grammar and prominence, and some others are non-idiomatic in the sense that you can modify some syntactic elements and you can vary the prominence to a certain extent then, But varying the prominence in some of these conversational routines, multi-word units, and so on, is sometimes taken by the listeners to be something humorous or idiosyncratic. Maybe it's something that is produced by a non-native speaker of English because he doesn't actually know the particular rules of prominence that are associated with these fixed elements, in a conversation routine. Well, we have some examples. Some single words can be conversation routines, discourse markers, or idiomatic expressions. So we're talking about words such as welcome or bye that express or have a very fixed, elocution force, whether they are welcoming people, giving a farewell, or we have some multi-word units like for that reason, in which certain elements, as we said, are fixed. We cannot, for example, say for that reason. But for that reason, because it's that is where the prominence goes then, is usually some of these conversation routines and multi-word units may be, let's say, encompassed in one independent tone unit, or they could be actually part of another tone unit there, I think that depends mostly on the location of the conversation routine or the multi-word unit. For example, Ashby mentions that if usually the longer multi-word units, when they occur in final position, they're actually made prominent then, and that means that they could also take an independent tone unit then, but we also had to bear in mind that some multi-word units may be unaccented, like if they are part of a tone unit, they may not receive, any particular prominence. Then we're talking about words such as at the moment or on the whole, attached as sort of tails then in certain tone units. But idiomaticity may not be the only factor that it can be included in this domain there of choice of prominent syllables. We can also have some words that actually reflect certain activity types, that is, speech events, okay, as sometimes they're called in pragmatics then. But we rather use the notion of activity type because we consider that to be more dynamic than as a notion then, okay? Well, what is the main characteristic of activity type? Okay, there are events that are goal-oriented and they are socially constituted there. It is usually, I think, quite illustrative for us to consider the activity type as a ritual. Okay, a ritual in which there are certain limitations to what the participants can do, where this activity type can take place, the roles that these participants may acquire, and the kind of contributions also, or speech acts may also be restricted because of this particular activity type. Some of the prototypical examples of activity types are teaching or learning, interviewing someone for a job, okay, taking part in a football game, any task in a workshop, then, and very simple rituals like activity types like knocking on, answering the door, and so sometimes we also have to bear in mind that these activity types can be embedded into larger activity types then, okay? Regarding prominence, okay, whenever the interactants, okay, the speakers, okay, they know that they're going to be taking a particular activity type, then they identify what activity type they're going to be involved in, and in that way they're going to retrieve the lexical choices, that is the vocabulary that is necessary to construe that particular activity type, and as a sort of by default, okay, they are also going to think about the corresponding prominent selections. A more traditional factor that could also impinge upon the selection of prominence is the concept of genre, okay? And what is genre? Very similar to activity types, or like activity types, then genre are a group of texts that share very specific discursive features, okay? We have here a quotation by Martin in which for him genre is a stage goal-oriented purposeful activity in which speakers engage as a member of a particular culture. As you can see, there are some elements in this definition that are very similar to the concept of activity type. But the concept of genre is probably older and mostly related to a written genre. So whenever we think about a genre, we think about letters and interviews, short and ghost stories. So there are traditional literary genres that you can think of, like a short story, a poem, a novel, or a play then, okay? In terms of the oral genres, okay, it's a little more difficult to delimit, okay, what an oral genre is then. But we know for sure that these oral genres has been, okay, passed to or transmitted to, okay, children by through the process of socialization, okay, both at home, both at schools, and that is, and because the native speaker English, okay, has a very close experience of observation of genres, he learns them and he uses these genres in real life. Some of the typical generic features that could help us distinguish one genre from another one is who is speaking, or who is the author, who is the intended audience, and what's the purpose and the situation in which it takes place, whether there is a physical form, whether there is a discourse structure with obligatory or optional elements, whether it has a style or register, a degree of formality, or whether it is prototypical, and so on then. Two further concepts have to be mentioned here in terms of genre. One is the concept of intertextuality, that is when texts are inserted into another text and therefore the voices of speakers, of different speakers, okay, are present in one single text then. And the other concept is interdiscursivity, in which we don't have just the insertion of a text as a product, but we have the insertion of complete activity types of a full-fledged social rituals, okay, in one discourse type then. In both cases, as we see, the pattern of prominent syllables may vary to distinguish between the matrix text and the embedded text, or the main discourse type and the embedded discourse types then. So through prominence, we can be able to distinguish when one, let's say, a lesson then, okay, that takes place in a classroom, at some point, okay, changes into more colloquial conversation between, okay, the teacher and, for example, the student. In terms of the prominence patterns, okay, as we said before regarding activity types, okay, the speakers have previous ideas about where to allocate the prominence in particular in their expressions, in their language chunks, and so on, by the use of the so-called selection slots, as Brazil calls them. And so for example, different discourse types like a poem, a political speech then, or an interview will also have very, okay, ritualistic, okay, prominence patterns then. But still, as I have said before, there are problems with the identification of genre. Why? Because there's usually a lot of flexibility in these characteristics of each particular genre, or because the speakers may get creative. There could be stylistic variations within the same genre, or there could also be a cultural variation as well then. For David Brazil in 1997, prominence could also be related to the concept of orientation, okay? And according to him, there are two types of orientation when we address, okay, a particular audience. There's one which is called the direct orientation and the oblique orientation. The oblique orientation, as he says there, is when these words and the expressions and the prominence patterns and so on, the intonation, they are rather a routine performance, a ritualistic performance, in which the speaker is not actually addressing, okay, his interlocutor or her interlocutor. The direct orientation, on the other hand, is when the linguistic expressions and the utterances, okay, are actually meant for the interlocutor, and both the speaker and hearer engage in this process of negotiation of meanings, something that is not the purpose, okay, or the goal of someone who is taking an oblique orientation. Well, examples of oblique orientations are the utterances that have a sort of pedagogical purpose, like lecturing or instructing someone to do something. David Brazil says that there's a recurrent use of the level tone and a sense of incompleteness then. Sometimes the speaker may adopt a special voice quality, which is very stereotypic. And some examples of this are the recitation of prayers, when the teacher is given reading the instructions in a test, military orders, and so on then. In terms of prominence then, Brazil says that a communicatively wise tone unit may contain few prominent syllables. In his system, okay, a prominent system regarding tone units, he says that each tone unit may have, okay, only two prominent syllables. Okay, if more than two prominent syllables are used, he says that we should be aware that the speaker is taking probably an oblique orientation. That is, he's becoming ritualistic, okay, and he's diverging from the hearer. Okay, that is, divergent means distancing himself or herself from the communicative value of the words involved, and not assuming responsibility for what he's saying, but rather, okay, assigning that responsibility to the language.